Welcome everyone to the Accessible Web Development Techniques presentation. I'm Jay Ryan from the state of Minnesota Office of Accessibility, and I'm privileged to serve as moderator of this event. This is a reshoot of a live event celebrating the 10th anniversary of the state of Minnesota Digital Accessibility Standard. So we will reprise the question we received from the audience at the original event. Each presenter will do a section, then we'll take questions from the audience. Let's get started with the event. To get us started, John Watne, Java developer with the Minnesota Department of Revenue, working with the Spring Forward Java server pages and Bootstrap to update Revenue's web application to be more accessible, better exhibit safe branding, and have better responsive web design. Followed by Jake Stark, web developer with Minnesota IT Services, partnering with the Department of Education, focusing on JavaScript and interactive map accessibility. Thanks, John, for starting us off, and please take it away.
Okay, these are some issues we encountered addressing accessibility issues in JSP pages. These were all examples coming from looking at a single web page that we had to fix to meet accessibility requirements. To test a JSP's compliance with Web Content Accessibility Group 2.0 AA requirements, which is the current state standard, we used the following free Google Chrome extensions: the Wave Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool browser extension, Accessibility Insights for Web, and Axe Accessibility for Development Teams. Our current process is that the page should be tested using all three tools, since each captures some items the others don't. For all of them, you will want to have the developer tools, pressing F12 in Google Chrome, the developer tools pane open to have all the navigation and highlighting capabilities available. For each tool, first address the alert critical items, then the warning items. We restrict our corrections to those items marked as required for WCAG 2.0 compliance. The Axe tool especially notes several items that are considered best practices but are not part of the requirements. These would be worth revisiting in the future. For first pass, we use the Wave Web Accessibility Evaluation tool. For easy navigation through items needing correction, go to the No Styles view, then the Alerts Flag tab on the left, and uncheck the Features, Structural Elements, and HTML5 and Aria elements. This will leave only the Errors and Alerts items that need to be addressed indicated. If there are alerts about missing header levels, check the Features element and uncheck all items except the various H heading level items. For second pass, we use Accessibility Insights for Web. This is a Microsoft product that builds upon the Axe extension but has a more user-friendly interface. We have only used its FastPass automated testing tool. In the future, it would be worthwhile to use the assessment option to walk through various items for manual testing, such as tab order. For any color contrast items that it finds, reload the page and analyze it using the Wave plugin, which does a better job of highlighting issues with color contrast. For third pass, we use the Axe extension. As a hint, you can save a few steps by just choosing it from the menu within the Developer Tools F12 pane view. Select it from the menu, then hit the Analyze button to analyze the current page. For an explanation of an issue found, highlight it in the left side of the Developer Tools window and click on the Learn More link under the Impact Evaluation to see what standard or best practice the item addresses. Here's a summary of items found, solutions, and recommendations. Sometimes you'll see Aria-required-children for list items. A page that used an unordered list, UL HTML attribute, of items for navigation which give rise to two related items found by Accessibility Insights for Web. Aria-required-children. Certain Aria roles must contain particular children, WCAG 1.3.1, and list item. LI elements must be contained in a UL or OL, and that's the same standard applies. This was caused by the UL having role equals tab list, while the LI child elements did not have the corresponding role equals tab. Adding role equals tab to each child LI clears both types of errors. Color contrast. Foreground-background color combinations for plain text, controls, labels, and all other text elements on the page must have to meet several requirements. Color contrast must meet the WCAG 1.4.3 minimum ratio standard. The Wave tool or an online color contrast analyzer can check this ratio. Background and foreground colors also have to be selected from the Minnesota brand color palette. And all color combinations must be approved by the Communications Department. In some cases where the requirements led to ratios that were inadequate for regular sized text on button controls with the desired background color, such as the sign-in button on the left here, the font size was increased so that it would pass the lower ratio required for large text, as shown in the larger button on the slide. Sometimes all that needs to be done for color contrast is to add a color that works for one state, for example, the hover pseudo attribute, to other states, such as active and focus, for the same ID or class selector. So before making that fix, the low contrast example, you'd have the on hover or active, you might apply something to hover, but then active or focus would then have the lower contrast example. You fix it, and then it's a stronger contrast, which meets the contrast requirements. Duplicate ID. An attribute must be unique, WCAG 4.1.1. Remember, IDs must be unique. Classes can be duplicated within a page. This was often caused by using the same ID value for array elements within a form displayed within a C for each loop. Since the associated form element containing the data has to be uniquely identified, the unique ID value can be patterned after the unique identification of the data element. In the simple example below, the ID is identical to the path, the identifier for the underlying form element. So we take the property type tab form, county property type form list, and then our variable is the property type row.index, and then we have property type code. So we just assign the same value that we have for the path to the ID, and that guarantees that it is a unique identifier. Use meaningful labels for IDs and classes to avoid running into issues with multiple reuses of labels like my tab within a single JSP. Label. Form elements must have labels. WCAG 1.3.1 and 3.3.2. A simple example of a single label for a form for a single input field, have the text that serves as a label for a single control refer to the unique ID for the control. For example, we have this search by ECRV ID, which is to label this search field to the right in the visual display. So you add the for equals mini CRV number ID, which references an input field with ID equals mini CRV number ID. For a more complicated example, you might have multiple input fields in a table. In this case, the column and row headings uniquely identify the input fields. If you use the Aria-labeled by attribute specifying the unique identifiers of the corresponding row and column heading values that uniquely label the input field, this will take care of properly labeling those fields. Here's an excerpt of a sample table. We've got our row heading, and we've got our column headings here. At the intersection of the two, since these in the leftmost column, we only have our row headings, we do not have a column heading just to indicate that. So for the HTML for the column headings, ID values uniquely identify those column headings. So we've got a ag acreage identifying the acreage 2A label. We've got an ID of ag EMV identifying the EMV 2A label. The HTML for the tilde row heading, ag tilde ID uniquely identifies it. So we added this ID for equals ag tilde to apply to the tilde row heading. So for the HTML for the input fields in the tilde row, Aria-labeled by attributes list IDs for the row and column headings, uniquely labeling each input. So, for example, here we have Aria-labeled by tag of ag tilde, ag acreage, and then we've got next to it, we've got Aria-labeled by ag tilde, ag EMV. Empty table header. Now, this was over a column of row headings which did not need their own label at the top of the column. So we'd get an error for this empty table header element. We replaced the table header with a TD element, table data element, and that can be blank, and that is the recommended practice for headings, column headings that are over a column that consists strictly of row headings. Page must contain a level 1 heading. Now this is a best practice rather than strictly a WCAG 2.0 requirement. The fix, we changed something that we just had the heading labeled, placed within a div. We had a div class equals app title containing the name of the application, changed that to a H1 with the class equals app title. An alternative fix for other pages where the first level heading is not visually necessary is to add the H1 title, but assign it Bootstrap's SR only class for screen reader only. Non-Bootstrap CSS solutions may also be found described online in Stack Overflow threads and the like, often moving headings or other elements with a specified class off screen and or shrinking them to very small size. This SR only style approach may be applied to headings at other levels as well. Alerts for heading level skipped. You want to properly nest headings and be consistent throughout sections. Heading levels within a page should look like an outline. For example, the page before the fixes started, the fixes were started, had 12 H4 headings, not preceded by a H1, H2, or H3 headings, then an H3 heading followed by 11 more H4 headings. After the fix, the page has one H1 heading, H2s are the next level, H3s are under H2s, and H4s are under H3s. Empty form label. This occurred from a misuse of a label tag for a control. It did not contain any text and was not labeling any control. It was serving solely as a Bootstrap positioning item. The fix was to change it from a label to a div. Empty heading. This was from a misused heading tag for a common modal dialog in which no text was provided. So it said H3 class equals modal title, ID equals custom title, and there was no text for the heading. The fix was to add the standard dialog heading. So I just placed a text warning on save changes in the dialog, and this is what the modal looks like when it is displayed. Empty button. Buttons whose text was only set by JavaScript. For example, it would just have your button element with various classes, data dismiss equals modal, and then there's no text for the button. The fix was to set the text by default. There's no need for the complexity of JavaScript setting a fixed text. So the first button was simply a continue button. The second button was simply a cancel button. So we used the appropriate text for those buttons. Alerts for an orphaned form label. This was because it was not associated properly. For example, a label was missing a for attribute. The associated text is not an input and has no ID by which to link the label. So here we had label class equals for ECRVID, but there's no for attribute. The fix was to add the for attribute to the label, referencing the added ID to the added input. So previously, this field did not have an ID associated with it. Now I note that since the displayed value is non-editable text for display only, the read only attribute was specified and the display only class was added. CSS was then used to remove the formatting for a standard text input field. And then we get an alert for an orphaned form label where it was misused. For example, used above the table, it was not a label for any control. So we just have this agricultural classifications as a form label that's not labeling anything. The fix was to instead put it in a proper heading and use classes and cascading style sheets to handle all of the formatting. Alert for Fieldset missing a legend. This was due to misusing a field set for an unlabeled container of buttons. For example, we have a field set with the class of form group. We have a button for add a sales price adjustment. The fix was to change from a field set to a div with the same class. So instead of using the field set with that class form group, we just change it to a div with class equals form group. An alert for an unlabeled form element with the title. We had a problem with drop-down lists. The legend text must also be within a properly associated label. Before we had this legend that said county that was within a div with class form group. After that, we placed a field set with class of form group, had the legend tag there, and within that legend attribute we added the label, we added the ID saying what the label is for, and then we put the label text in there. Alert for a redundant link. We had a standard search result navigation which had a previous link next to a 1 for the first page link. We decided to leave this as it is. If a design decision was made to disable one or the other for the first page of results, the alert would go away. Complications arise with third-party code. Even if you use a third-party library such as Bootstrap that is at least reasonably accessible, you may wind up adding extensions to those libraries that are not accessible. For example, we use a Bootstrap select library for styling multi-select dropdowns. The code generated by the library violates the Aria-required-children rule discussed earlier for a different situation. What is the best solution? Updated code fixes the problem. Often development work on this external code is intermittent at best. Replace with another option. Does it both have comparable functionality and fix the accessibility issues? And then the get your hands dirty version, modify the existing code or develop your own extension. This is much more complicated, and you have to know if resources, human and time and knowledge are available. And fortunately, since I wrote this slide, actually another of our developers actually found a solution digging into the code, and they fixed the code themselves. So that was a very nice fix. Some final thoughts. Write accessible code when writing the initial code. It can be considerably harder to retroactively correct it. We've gotten into the practice now of when you review, we do code reviews for code that we submit for approval. And part of that testing now is to do all 3 automated test tools on it right up front before we check any code into version control. So that helps things considerably. And when working with controls, when developing and reviewing the design requirements, consider whether the control being used is the best one for the situation. The United States Web Design System's documentation on components has some really good recommendations on when and when not to use various components, and offers suggestions on what might be a better control for a given situation. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm Jake Stark. I'm a web developer. I work for the state of Minnesota, MNIT, partnering with the Department of Education. And I'm going to give a presentation today on accessible web design techniques. First, some accessibility basics. Use semantic HTML from the start. It is important to use proper structural elements when you develop a site. HTML elements communicate to the browser what kind of content they contain and how the browser should render or treat that content. HTML tags also tell browsers something about the contents and the meaning of the content. Although it's easy to use CSS to style any element to look however you'd like, it is important to use HTML tags as intended whenever possible, such as use of a button tag versus styling a div tag to look like a button. Headings mark where the content starts. They're tags given to text to define its style and purpose. Headings also establish the hierarchy of the content of the page. Likewise, screen readers also use heading tags to read content. This way, people with low vision get an overview of the page by reading each heading in the hierarchical flow. Adding alternative text for images is the first principle of web accessibility. This text acts as a replacement for the image if it fails to load and will read the alt text and provide the information to the non-sighted users. Alt text should answer this question: what is the content conveyed by the image? When including links in your content, use text that properly describes where the link will go. Using click here is not considered descriptive and is ineffective for a screen reader user. Reading order. Implementing a logical tab order is an important part of providing your users with a smooth keyboard navigation experience. Assistive technologies render web page content based upon the sequence of the DOM elements within the HTML document. The flow of information should make sense. Some users will access content through the use of a keyboard by pressing the tab or arrow keys, or through the use of alternative input devices. As a result, the tab order should match the visual order, so keyboard-only users are able to logically navigate through the site content. Long pages with lots of content should be broken up with anchor links or jump lists, allowing keyboard-only users to skip to relevant portions of the page without having to negotiate through other content. Skip to main content should be provided at the top of each page, so keyboard-only users won't have to tab through the page navigation in order to get to the main content. Single-page applications and dynamic content. When content updates dynamically, for example, without a page refresh, screen readers may not be aware. This includes screen overlays, light boxes, in-page updates, pop-ups, and modal dialogues. Keyboard-only users may be trapped in page overlays. These functions can easily be made accessible. Some options include using Aria roles and alerts to help indicate to the assistive technology user that something changed on the page. If you are using any unique widgets, such as a calendar picker or drag and drops, be sure to test for accessibility or usable without relying on mouse input. Aria, or Accessible Rich Internet Applications, is a complex, powerful technical specification for adding accessibility information to elements that are not natively accessible. You should always use native HTML elements when they are available. However, the first rule of Aria is don't use it unless you really need to. Many functions that used to require Aria attributes are now implemented in HTML5, and you can do more harm than good by adding Aria attributes and HTML tags that do not need it. For example, use the native HTML button tag instead of the Aria role of button. Use the standard HTML label tag instead of Aria-label or Aria-labeled by when possible. Use the HTML5 nav tag instead of the Aria role of navigation. In single-page applications where only a portion of the page changes dynamically as the user navigates or performs an action, make sure that client-side view changes are known to screen reader users by announcing the change in page title, using Aria Live regions and/or focus management. For example, a map pop-up that changes its content when an item is selected. Using the Aria Live attribute ensures that when the content is updated inside the element, those changes are communicated to users of assistive technology. Forms. The first rule to create a truly accessible form is to use native HTML form controls. Since we use the native HTML controls, the name, role, and state of the elements are exposed by default to all assistive technologies. Each field in your form should have a well-positioned descriptive label. For example, if the field is for a person's name, it should be labeled appropriately as either full name or have two separate fields labeled as first name and last name. Use the label tag or an Aria property to associate the label text with the form field. As you are going through a form field, a person should be able to tab through the form and fill out all the fields before getting to the submit button, or they may not even realize that additional fields exist. Essentially, the tab order should follow the visual order. If you have fields that are related or similar, consider grouping them together using field sets. For example, fields like full name and date of birth could be grouped together as personal information. This type of form organization can help a screen reader user keep track of progress and can provide the context that might be lost while filling out the form. In this example, the input tags are embedded within the field set tag and includes a legend tag that gives a proper label for the grouping. The legend gives the proper context to assistive technology readers to help the inputs make sense. In this field set, the legend is full name, and both first and last name are the inputs included along with the proper label tags for each. Visible focus states. Have you noticed the blue outlines that sometimes show up around links, inputs, and buttons? These outlines are called focus indicators. Focus indicators help people know which element has the keyboard focus and help them understand where they are when navigating your site. Don't rely on the browser. It is important to use CSS to customize focus states. Always with testing, it's always good to test early and often. Many times you can get to the end of a project and you find that you're using something that's completely inaccessible and you're going to have to maybe rewrite it. So as you go along, it's important to know either you're using something that's accessible already, or maybe you can do a quick test and make sure whatever element you're developing or widget is accessible before you get too far along in the process. It can save you time. Some testing tools that are recommended for in-page testing, you can use the WAVE, Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool, WebAIM Color Contrast Checker. And then there's some browser extensions out there for Chrome and Firefox, for WAVE, Arc Toolkit, Axe, and Andy. And some more tools out there. There's the Color Contrast Analyzer, which is a free tool for testing color contrast with text and images and such. Keyboard testing is always important. Assistive technologies, JAWS, NVDA, Dragon Naturally Speaking, and Browser Zoom. And other resources to look out there, W3 Schools has good information and resources, web accessibility tutorials, WCAG Quick Reference, and the WebAIM site. And that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake. Thank you, John. Both of those were terrific presentations. So now let's go with some questions from the audience. Here's the first question. I have a design that calls for 3 separate pieces of data on the button of an accordion, the accordion header. Can div tab index equal 0, roller button be used in this case? So who would like to take the question first? So both of you have a chance.
This is John. I think we can use a tab index of 0 for those. Yeah, I'd have to look into that for sure to know how best to handle that. Gosh, I don't know. I'd have to look into that more.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Jake. We got time for one more question. So our question I'm wondering is what if we want to embed a visualization in an application such as Tableau or with Maps? And Jake, I think you can answer that one first, and then John can go what you reply to that. Thank you.
Yeah, I can speak to the Tableau part. That's some experience that I've had. We have an application on our website for ECLDS, and we have something called data stories in that application. And in that data stories, there's multiple Tableau embedded visualizations. What I use for that is the Tableau JavaScript API. And what you can do with that is I took some of the controls out of the Tableau and put them in the HTML page manually, like instead of embedded within the Tableau sheet, because we had some accessibilities with Tableau using just the embedded controls. So what I did is I took those controls and put them on my HTML page, and then I used the Tableau JavaScript API to work with the embedded Tableau visualization. So if a drop down in my HTML is selected, one of the filters, it requeries the Tableau report and refreshes it on the page. Another thing we did with that was we created tables. So what it would do is using the Tableau JavaScript API, if you select the table button, it'll actually pull the data out from the Tableau visualization and then I build the HTML tables on the page right there. So that way we had some issues with Tableau accessibility, just embedding it on the page, not having data tables and such. So we were able to solve that by using the API and doing it in a more manual way. Okay, that's all we have for questions today. So I'm going to share my screen and to wrap up. So again, thanks to everyone for participating in this. And I would like to encourage everybody to visit Minnesota's Office of Accessibility website, where we have many resources, not only for web developers, but also for documents, for maps, and for many other accessibility-related issues for digital accessibility. Also, we encourage you to subscribe to the monthly digital accessibility newsletter. We post links to these kind of recordings as well as to many other resources, and everything fresh and new every month. Was a fun way to stay up to date on what's going on with the state of Minnesota and in the world of accessibility. Finally, I want to say thank you to everyone for attending and watching this, and thank you to Jay Stark and John Watne, as well as to Kim Wee, who helped organize all of these things as well. She unfortunately could not make it today. So John, Jay, thank you very much, and thanks to everyone who helped make this event happen. Again, have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.